This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Archaeologists call it the oldest temple on the face of the earth, but the question is, what inspired, or rather, who inspired humans to build it? That's the topic of our conversation. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me is a gentleman who's got a forthcoming book on this particular topic and has also written a recent paper that was the last program that you heard here on A View from the Bunker regarding the origins of the Eurasian word that in various languages means rulers or kings or what have you. We'll kind of morph from that into the subject of his forthcoming book on the mysterious site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. He is the founder of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, and he is the author of Interview with the Giant, Conversations with the Nephilim, or Ethno-Historical Notes with the Nephilim. I'm trying to do this off the cuff, Judd, so forgive me. Okay. Bad host. We welcome back to the bunker our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Jed Burton. Jed, thanks for joining me tonight. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. So, yeah, forgive me for mangling not only your CV, the books that you've written and so forth. Anyway, just this once. Okay. This once. The Institute of Biblical Anthropology, and on the web. Let me get the website in at the beginning of the program this time instead of waiting all the way through. BurtonBeyond.com. Now, we talked last time and about the fascinating evidence that points to that area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus Mountains region, as the origin for the word that points to sort of the antediluvian, the pre-flood world, the god kings of that time, the Rephaim, the Nephilim, and how that I found that extremely fascinating and very exciting because it tracks with other research that I've been digging into by the archaeologists Giorgio and Marilyn Kelly Bucciolati at Tel Mozan in northern Syria, the site of Urkesh, because they connect the Hurrians, who were the Horites in the Bible, with a culture called the Kura Araxes civilization, which originated in the very same place as the origin of this word. And of course, we also know the Sumerians' original homeland is most likely that very same place as well. So all the arrows, when you go back in time, are pointing back to that location, which just happens to be the Ararat Plain, below the mountains of Ararat, where a very famous boat came to rest. But to the southwest of there, in southern Turkey, is another fascinating site that, again, archaeologists, scholars have deemed the oldest temple on the face of the earth. They put it at about 10,000 BC. We talked a little bit about that last time, the influence of the Watchers, or a previous program, the Watchers and Göbekli Tepe. How does all of this come together there? What is the influence of the Watchers, both in terms of religion and culture, on humanity, and what connection is there to Göbekli Tepe? Well, my research has really pointed to Göbekli Tepe as kind of it's a military outpost, not in the conventional sense, but when you're thinking about supernatural warfare, the entire reason for most people will associate the Watchers with the Mount Hermon event, and rightly so, the Genesis 6 event. But there certainly seems to be a presence of the Watchers here, and the thesis that I built in the chapters that I worked on in the forthcoming book have to deal with a stratagem not terribly dissimilar to the Tower of Babel. In other words, the Watchers knew in a general sort of way, to what specificity they knew that Eden, the Garden of Eden, had been in that region of eastern Turkey. They thought that they could either win the angel guarding Eden over to them, or that they could actually in some way weaponize this connection between heaven and earth. And that
the subtext really of not just the work that I've done for that book, but also this paper that I put out last time, is that you're looking at very, very pointed, very deliberate, very directed manipulations of human culture. And Göbekli Tepe, the Mesolithic, Neolithic Levant, as it were, at that time, is very representative of this 90-degree angle culture change in human history, because ostensibly for hundreds of millennia before that, or depending on what time frame, what chronology people subscribe to, humans had been hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists of a sort for most of human history. And in order for something like these kinds of changes, when they happen in human societies impacted by other human societies, the ones doing the influence are greatly superior in terms of technology, in terms of militarism, in terms of their general achievements as civilizations, and they're the ones that are able to steer, often for their own ends, these kinds of changes. And I think that's exactly what you have. It's really what you have to have with a change as significant as the ones that are happening in the late Mesolithic and the Neolithic periods, in terms of, this is when you begin to see this change in social organization amongst humans. It's so drastically different from what had come before. It's the emergence of city-states, civilizations for all intents and purposes. Not that everybody became city dwellers and city builders overnight, but you definitely had pockets of human society that were beginning to adopt this model, and it was not something that had been the prevailing model in human history up to that point. So, yeah, you can argue independent invention, all you want about this, but the fact of the matter remains is that these are significant, drastic culture changes taking place, and in my estimation, they're prompted by the influence of the Watchers, and that legacy is continued with the Nephilim and the Rephaim and the giants that are related, to that sort of not just genetic lineage, but also the intellectual traditions that they brought with them. Again, I'm looking at all of this in terms of a culture of the Watchers, a culture of the Nephilim, a culture of the Rephaim. I'm trying to take their machinations and their behavior apart, like an anthropologist would, if they had people to interview in a society with them. So, that first book that I wrote, Interview with a Giant, I called it Ethno-Historical Notes because ethnohistory was essentially what I was trying to do in piecing together a culture sketch of the giants. And for me, I didn't really see anybody else that was doing that. So I'm not tooting my own horn, but I think it's a novel approach that's yielding some insights that we hadn't seen before, maybe some considerations that biblical scholars haven't considered before by applying anthropology. And again, I'm not the first person to apply anthropology to the Bible, but in terms of looking at the Watchers and the giants, there weren't a whole lot of people that were, using ethnology and ethnography and things of that nature to try and rebuild, to reconstitute a sketch of the culture of the Watchers and the giants. And bringing that back to Göbekli Tepe, Klaus Schmidt and his peers who excavated the site and basically have written the culture narrative behind the history of Göbekli Tepe, to my knowledge, these are not people of faith. They're secularists. But you see in the literature again and again that the archaeologists interpret from the evidence at hand that the people that built Göbekli Tepe believed that it was a portal of some kind to the netherworld. And furthermore, it's really, like I used to tell my students, Göbekli Tepe is the paradigm that breaks the paradigm. Yes, these Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Harappan cities were not the earliest. There were earlier civilizations than that. But Göbekli Tepe is even different in terms of its cultural significance, its revolutionary significance, in fact, in the trajectory of human culture, because for the longest time, historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, cultural scholars of all kinds believed that the direct prerequisite, the foundational element for civilization, was the development of agriculture. Well, we now know that at places, particularly Göbekli Tepe, there's an abundance of evidence that it was religion that prompted the building of this sacred city, this temple city, this large multi-temenos city, not agriculture, then all the other elements of civilization. It was the religion, this corpus of cult practices and beliefs in higher entities, not just dead ancestors, but these higher otherworldly entities, the gods, these gods that were anthropomorphic. It was this that prompted the building of Göbekli Tepe, and things like agriculture and division of labor and the centralized politics, et cetera, et cetera. All of those were epiphenomenal of the actual building of Göbekli Tepe.
It's a change in culture that's almost like what you'd see when an advanced civilization, similar to what we saw here in the Americas, when you had the Europeans with advanced technology encountering essentially Stone Age civilizations in the natives here. And I'm not trying to belittle the people that were encountered by the early French, English, Spanish settlers who arrived here, but that's just the way it was. I mean, you've got gunpowder on the one hand and bows and flint arrows on the other.
Certainly.
You're going to find
I think scholars like Jared Diamond have done a good job, illustrating that kind of change. And it was scholars like, broad meta thinking, big picture thinking historians and cultural scholars like Jared Diamond and Thomas Sowell even, writes about a lot of the similar sort of things. And you read about these, these kinds of cultural reverberations in some of the old Annales school of history from authors like Fernand Braudel, but particularly people like Sowell and Diamond do a really good job of illustrating this clash between the European explorers, European colonizers, and the Stone Age level society of the New World. And, the ramifications for the New World were drastic, not just in terms of the militarism that dwindled their numbers, but you also had all kinds of biological factors like smallpox, these diseases that were born amongst herd animals that people from the old world had been basically inoculated against for thousands and thousands of years. And so you have all these causes, all of these elements set up long before these two peoples come into contact. Now, by analogy, when you use that same sort of model in terms of the contact between the Watchers, not only at Mount Hermon, but also in places like Göbekli Tepe and ostensibly other places in the world, the ramifications for human society were drastic because it changed the way that we thought about the use of our environment. There were concepts and ideas that were introduced that were forbidden to us. There were practical sciences like agriculture and meteorology and things like that, but there's also this occult twisting of it. And as I pointed out, in terms of language, because language is culture, it is idea, it is the cultural trajectory of humanity. It's so easily manipulable by these higher entities that we end up having words that carry the baggage of their influence, like the aforementioned words for king in Eurasian languages.
This, I think, is really interesting because one of the things scholars have tried to figure out is why things changed so drastically during the Uruk period, which is the 4th millennium BC. So roughly 4,000 down to about 3,100 BC, which is the pretty well agreed upon end of the Uruk period. Göbekli Tepe we're talking about is probably 6,000 years older than that, according to the way archaeologists date things.
Mm-hmm.
Where does the flood fit in there, and then how then does all of this information about division of labor and then reestablish itself with the growth of not just the Uruk civilization, which is the kingdom of Nimrod in the south of Iraq, in the south of Mesopotamia, but also with the Hurrians now that, again, the Bucciolatis have discovered since just 1999 or thereabouts, going back to about the mid-'80s when they started digging there, the spread of that civilization from the north, the Hurrian civilization from the north, the Sumerian civilization from the south, kind of meeting in the middle in the 4th millennium BC, showing this development of urban civilization, and again, this same sort of division of labor and this stratification of society. How does that come back after the flood, assuming that Göbekli Tepe was pre-flood?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, to my mind, Göbekli Tepe was pre-flood, and its existence is rather short-lived in history, no more than 2,000 years, and we know that it was backfilled, eventually by the occupants, which presents some interesting questions as well. But to my mind, the Noahic flood, the deluge, is the same series of cataclysmic events that occurred during the late Pleistocene, the transition between the late Pleistocene epoch and the early Holocene epoch. You had periods of for all intents and purposes, you had worldwide flooding. There were drastic, dangerous solar activity, lots of mass coronal ejection, some of it actually making it through the Van Allen belts. We can read in the archaeological records where exactly it vitrified, melted surface rock. There's rock art from this latitude in the northern hemisphere that some scholars think preserves the pattern that you would see in the ionization in the atmosphere at the time, kind of like the aurora borealis, but there was a specific kind of pattern to it that you see recurring all around the world. And of course, the sun it controls our weather, and so this had drastic ramifications for coming off of the last ice age. You've got all these glacial melts. The sea is rising. This is having an impact on the geography, the surface geography of the Earth, and taken together, there's a lot of seismic activity that's going on as well. So it's a very, very tumultuous period where you had these periods of extended torrential rains and snows. So it's also interesting to consider, that the deluge, since it's preserved in world mythology with such continuity, that at the end of the day, particularly for scholars that know the cultural value of mythology, something happened so drastic that it burned itself into our collective cultural memory. And the more I consider it, the more I look at the late Pleistocene, early Holocene transition, sometimes called the Younger Dryas event. The more that I look at that through the lens of the Bible, it seems to line up with the deluge, to my mind. And you've got other sources, where Plato, is recounting the story of Atlantis.
Yeah.
Clearly we know that there was civilization clearly in the Neolithic ancient Near East. There's no reason that it couldn't be there, and ostensibly was there in other places. And if we're to believe Plato's account in Timaeus and Critias, then his forebear Solon got this story from the Egyptians around 600 BC, and said that all of this took place some 9,000 years before. Well, that puts you right at the end of the late Pleistocene, this right smack dab in the middle of this transition between the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene epochs. So, yeah, to my mind, Göbekli Tepe is pre-flood, and the more and more I consider it, the more and more I think this Younger Dryas event was the Noahic flood.
The fact that the site was backfilled and ritually buried, apparently, is really intriguing. We were talking before the program about that odd serpent mound of Bashan, which we discussed with Doug Van Dorn, who, to give credit where credit is due, was the first one to go public with that in his book, Giants,
Indeed.
Sons of the Gods. That, likewise, the settlements on the back of that ridge, just north of Gilgal Rephaim, were likewise ritually buried at the time the site was abandoned, which, according to Dr. Michael Freakman, who excavated there, was about 3,500 BC. So much later. But this is something that we've seen again and again. In fact, Joshua's altar, which was found and excavated by Adam Zertal around 1980, that was also ritually buried. Apparently, at the time, the Israelites relocated from there to Shiloh. What would have caused that? I mean, do you have any ideas, any thoughts as to why people would take a site as big as Göbekli Tepe, which is much larger than the site of Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal, or the Serpent Mound there and the Golan Heights? Why would they go to all that trouble?
Well, where there are remaining questions for the scholarly community at large, I honestly believe that the people saw the negative impact, that somehow they found out what the Watchers were up to. They lived in a world of giants. They saw the negative impact. They saw what was going on, the war, the cannibalism, the drinking of blood, the usurping of humanity's resources, which consequently probably contributed to the decline in the population of megafauna during that time, because that's something else that happens in the Pleistocene, is you basically have all the big megafaunal populations. And certainly, there were there's overhunting going on, but it's not just humans that are hunting them. It's these gigantic Nephilim that are literally, those are the resources that they're consuming. Yeah,
mammoth burgers and woolly rhinoceros
exactly.
steaks.
Mammoth burgers, mastodon burgers, exactly. Yeah. Of course, when those creatures die out, your apex predators like dire wolves and short-faced bear and saber-toothed cats and things like that are going to die out too. So I believe, from everything that I've been researching, that these people saw that the Watchers did not have the best interest of these people at heart, and that's one of the reasons that I think they backfilled this site, was to basically cover it up in the hopes that the information would never reemerge. But by then it was really too late, because there were other sites that we know that are proximate to Göbekli Tepe, most notably Novali Chori, where the same kind of imagery, and also period Shanlurfa as well has archaeological strata that date to this time period. These outlying places were already impacted by the material and ideological culture of Göbekli Tepe. That's borne out in the archaeological record. So it was really, even though they were trying to do away with those influences, it was really too late. And of course, depending on what you believe after the flood, if there were other incursions of fallen angels, or however the gigantic line reasserted itself, we know that legacy continued on after the flood. And again, that's something that I hit on in the paper that I recently wrote.
Yeah, fascinating, too, that again, that we see this pop up would have been relatively quickly, I think, after the flood, with the sudden emergence of the Sumerian civilization down in the south, and again, the recent discovery that the idea that the civilization, city-based civilization, stratification of society, all of that started around Eridu, which would have been on the shore of the Persian Gulf at the time. It's due to siltation, it's about 75 miles inland now, and then spread north from there, and Ur and Uruk and those cities to the north, rather toward the north. But it appears that there were cities in the north, like, besides Urkesh, you had the city of Nagar, which is Tel Brak, where you've got those weird eye idols that have been found just about 30 miles south of there. So it seems that urban civilization was growing up there at the same time as the big civilizations in Sumer in the south, and all of it tracing its way back to that one location. So we've got a timeline roughly that coincides with the archaeological record, and in turn coincides with the outline of history that we see in the Bible. And amazing that through that bottleneck there at the end of at the Lesser Dryas, the flood, that enough memory was preserved that these stories of the Watchers and the angels, the God Kings who lived before the flood, has been preserved in cultures all over the world. Mm-hmm. So the influence then of Göbekli Tepe after the flood, what was preserved there, and how has that influenced the world since?
Well, of course, there's some interesting apocryphal clues, I think, here. I'm thinking about Arphaxad's rediscovery of the Watcher writing in one of the passages in, I think it's Jasher. Pretty sure it's Jasher. Now, to me, this seems like at least one of the instances where some of that information was recovered, because obviously the Watchers recorded this in different places, and how they did it, whether it was literally in writing, I don't know. That seems to be the implication, because there was Watcher writing that was outlined, that was recovered by Arphaxad, but the legacy of Göbekli Tepe is, if this is a case study in the development of the institutions, the elements of civilization, those tenets by which those criteria by which we assess a civilization, then that's certainly going to be a lasting legacy of Göbekli Tepe, because it's something that where you can see it piecemeal in the Apocrypha, in works like Enoch, where you've got a material case study in terms of Göbekli Tepe. And so the overarching legacy is this system that was imposed of highly centralized, autocratic, abusive, opportunistic rule, in which the population serviced these literal, God Kings at the apex of the social pyramid, as it were. First with the Watchers, and then with their progeny, the Nephilim and the Rephaim, in the post-flood world. And so that's what I'm saying is that this, the example that I used in the paper was a word that's so ensconced in our usage today, but it's part of that building block of this style of rule and abuse that the Watchers developed for their own ends, that carried over throughout human history. Because as we discussed the last time, this sort of government has been the rule and not the exception in human history, anywhere a society develops into a civilization. It's a historical and cultural invariant.
Other than the what you describe as a 90-degree shift in human culture, exemplified at Göbekli Tepe, where suddenly you've got this this settlement that was that grew specifically for this religious site, not for mutual defense necessarily, not for because you had a guild of potters who found a really great deposit of clay or anything like that. It was specifically for this one purpose, to service this religious site. Other than that, what is it about the specifics at the site, the artifacts that have been found, that suggest to you a literal supernatural presence there that inspired it? In other words, what is there about the religion there? What do we know about that religion from the clues that have been found on the ground?
Well, of course, the big thing that distinguishes the kind of religion at Göbekli Tepe from, let's say, most of what you find amongst hunter-gatherers, and I should start off and say that in hunter-gatherer societies, most of the religion is animistic or totemistic. In other words, there's a kind of general belief in spirits, that all things are kind of imbued with there's a Polynesian term that anthropologists use, mana, as kind of life force, and that in the case of totemism, or you've got animal reverence, they're entire clans of people that believe that they're not only supernaturally linked to these animals, but they're in fact descended from them, that they founded their line in some way. And then you have ancestor worship, which is this sort of, most religious scholars try and put it on the scale. Again, they're sort of looking at it through the evolutionary lens. Evolution as a concept impacted all these different disciplines, and so they're always wanting to look from the simplest to the more complex. Well, it doesn't always work that way, but what they want to do in most cases in the narrative is to use ancestor worship, the worship of the dead, as a sort of transition from totemism and animism to the reverence of anthropomorphic deities, as a reflection of the cultural evolutionary changes that are taking place, as they argue, in the development of civilization. They really haven't. It's really interesting to me. They can take. They can take work from people like Fraser and Edward Tyler and some of these guys that built these models of, first we start off in savagery, then we move to barbarism, then we move to civilization. Well, it doesn't always work on this evolutionary linear scale that they want to apply to everything. But anyway, that's what they want to do, is use this reverence of the dead. But that reverence of the dead is part of this larger package that the Watchers are introducing at places like Göbekli Tepe. But the material legacy here, of course, are the actual anthropomorphic representations. Now, you definitely have theriomorphic representations. You've got the animals of the region who were undoubtedly part of the totemic toolkit of these people. Jaguars and adders and scorpions and vultures and leopards and all kinds of things. Maybe even West Asian lions, and certainly the aurochs, the big bull representations. But the distinguishing thing here are the T-shaped pillars are these big, along with these big anthropomorphic pillars, and they're clearly anthropomorphic because you can see that there are arms that are etched into the side of them in bas relief, and they're wearing loincloths. So, to my mind, this doesn't just represent a novel shift in the religious consciousness of these people, but it's indicative of this outside influence that I've been talking about, and that influence are the Watchers. And the people at Göbekli Tepe represented them anthropomorphically because that's how they presented themselves. That's how they manifested in our reality as anthropomorphic.
So why Göbekli Tepe? I mean, when you look at the Book of Enoch, it describes the descent of the Watchers to Mount Hermon, which is in the southern Levant, not that far north of the Sea of Galilee. Göbekli Tepe is in Turkey. That's quite a ways away. So why there instead of somewhere in the Levant?
Well, it all goes back to Eden, to my mind. And I believe the location is there in eastern Turkey. You know, again, you can debate about the headwaters the headwaters of two of those rivers, but we know where the other two are, and generally where the headwaters would have been in prehistory, those being the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so eastern Turkey is, to me, the ideal location to where this great river that flowed through the country of Eden split into four rivers where this garden was, this location where heaven and earth actually met. And the Watchers thought that they could weaponize that. And that, since we're talking about a war whose methods are supernatural, then of course there's going to be a religious component to this. And the base, that's why I call Göbekli Tepe a Watcher outpost. In that respect, it's like a military outpost, because they were trying to use the same stratagem that was utilized at the Tower of Babel to basically assault heaven. Or at least they were hoping to do that, which is why they established such a powerhouse of a cultural influencer like Göbekli Tepe in eastern Turkey. And of course, this region remained very important to the biblical narrative because it had ramifications for, this is where Noah, you mentioned the mountains of Ararat, Noah and his family come to rest in the ark there. You get the reboot of humanity essentially here. There are great cases to be made for, in fact, better cases to be made for Abraham's Ur being in this region as well. And so it very clearly had significance, really. In a kind of Tower of Babel style assault. But they could also, again, they weren't all-knowing. They're not all-knowing, all-seeing, but they had enough insight to where they could see farther down the road than we can, just because they're celestial beings. They knew that this region was going to be important to Abraham, that God was going to call Abraham out of this region. They knew that it was going to be important to Noah. They knew that it would probably have prophetic implications in terms of the geopolitics of the age in which we're living at right now. And ostensibly, for passages like in Revelation that talk about the angels being chained at the Euphrates River, we're all talking about the same sacred space, essentially.
Yeah. In fact, I stumbled onto something here, not to rabbit trail, but Shanlurfa is very close to that this location. Shanlurfa, Haran, where Abraham made his final departure for the land of Canaan, is on the headwaters of the Belik River. Is that? Did I pronounce that correctly?
That's right.
Okay, and stumbled onto something in the Hurrian religion where that river is connected to a term that in Sumerian, and I'm going to forget the term here, but I think it's Kasker Key or something, but it's essentially a water course that leads to the netherworld, and that term was applied to the Belik River. So you've got that in that region. In other words, it's sort of like a Mesopotamian river Styx.
Yes, and here's and I'll rabbit trail a little bit off of your rabbit trail. The idea of rivers leading into the underworld, particularly if they flow into caves or in certain cardinal directions,
right.
There's an example of that, of course, at Banyas,
right.
The cave of Pan, the headwaters of the Jordan. when you consider the Cherokee, for instance, believed that the direction of death was west, and that it was going along western flowing rivers. These western flowing rivers were the entrance into the underworld. That's why the Trail of Tears was such a smack in the face to them in a lot of ways, because they believe, it wasn't just that they were being removed from their land. Their beliefs preserved this idea. Consider how important, the imagery of water was to the Maya in terms of entrances to the underworld.
Yeah.
In the Yucatan, which was considerably drier than other highland mountain portions of Mayan territory, they had cenotes, these places, basically seasonal ponds and lakes that would catch water, and they would offer human sacrifices. There have been skeletons of not only adults but also many children found with all kinds of offerings given along with these human sacrifices, and so that this sort of brings us full circle to the concepts like the Apsu, the watery underworld of the Mesopotamians.
Right.
So that's another example of the imprint of the Watchers and the Nephilim on human culture. Is this not just some abstract idea, but an idea that existed in a supernatural reality. In other words, it wasn't stuck in the prison of some materialistic dogma, but yet it existed in reality, in supernatural reality.
One of the things I find fascinating, and I guess we'll continue down this rabbit trail for a bit, is two things. The word for mountain in Sumerian, Ker, also meant netherworld, and they had a separate mountain. They had a separate word rather in Sumerian that meant mountain. That's Hersag, Nin Hersag, who was the consort of Enlil, was the Nin, meaning I guess lady, so lady of the mountain. But that meant mountain and only mountain, whereas Ker, K-U-R, meant mountain but also netherworld. And Enlil, who I'm going to argue in a forthcoming book, is to be identified with El of the Canaanites and Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn of the Romans, Kumarbi of the Hurrians and Hittites. His chief epithet was Great Mountain. Ker Gal meaning big. So did it mean Great Mountain or did it mean Great Netherworld? Because each of these entities, Enlil, after he was replaced by Marduk as the chief of the pantheon in Mesopotamia, El, who was his abode was at the source of the double deeps, or the place of the double deeps. Kumarbi, who was worshipped through that ritual pit called the Abi, and of course Kronos and Saturn, we know, as well as Kumarbi, all banished to the netherworld by the storm god when he took over. This idea then of this veneration of the dead, was this a post-flood invention? Did this exist prior to the flood at Göbekli Tepe, or was this a post-flood invention by these entities? And I heard a great way of putting this the other day, because somebody was asking me, how is it if these entities are in chains in gloomy darkness, as Peter writes in 2 Peter 2:4 and Jude verses 6 and 7, if they're in chains in gloomy darkness, how can they still influence the world? And somebody else chimed in on this thread and said, well, it's like the biggest guys who are running drugs are the ones who are behind bars in prison.
Yes, and I think there's a case to be made for not just myths that are associated with caves, but the kinds of rituals that are conducted in caves. It's not a thesis that I've worked out, but I've sort of had it in the back of my mind, and I will in the near future, is that this is potentially one of the ways in which the imprisoned watchers, the imprisoned fallen angels, exert that kind of influence. When you think of Zeus was born and nurtured in a cave,
right,
on a mountain in the center of Crete, and Muhammad, claims to have been visited by Gabriel in a cave in which he dictates, the Quran. So there's something here about this chthonic sort of interface, with the subterranean world that is also recurrent in world mythology. And I think that there's something there. I think that that's a way that the Watchers still exert influence.
Come to that, because you've got Banias, the Grotto of Pan at the base of Mount Hermon, which, as was considered to be the entrance to the netherworld in the ancient world. In fact, all of Bashan, when you start looking at the location of the dolmen fields north of the Sea of Galilee and in the Golan Heights, that was just a big necropolis, that whole area.
Yeah.
You've got this idea of the freshwater abyss, the Abzu, beneath the temple of Enki at Eridu, but also a similar thing that was a place where water was poured out into a ritual opening to the netherworld. Both the Hurrians with their Kaskur key or whatever that term was. The Amorites had a similar thing at the ancient city of Hierapolis, which is northern Syria, Manbij now. The temple of Atargatis, which was just another name for Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte. But there's a cave right below the Temple Mount. In fact, directly below the foundation stone, which is right at the center of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. Mm-hmm. This has been attested for years and years. This was the site, the threshing floor of Araunah, that Hurrian overlord of the Jebusites, when David and his men took the city. Apparently, that threshing floor of his, and Sharon had made the case in our book Giants, Gods, and Dragons, that the threshing floor of El, which is mentioned in the Canaanite Rephaim text, the threshing floor was considered in the ancient world a type of portal. Mm-hmm. But like on Mount Hermon, where you've got that cave at the base, on the Mount Zion, the Temple Mount, you've got this cave directly below the foundation stone, where Solomon which was supposed to have been right on the spot where Abraham was tested on Mount Moriah, with this cave below, where in fact the Muslims to this day call it the Well of Souls.
Yeah.
So there's a strange. I'm not a coincidence theorist, so I find it hard to call it a coincidence. Yeah,
I doubt that it is.
And again, it's this as above, so below sort of thing, where you've got this netherworld connection to a raised, a high place.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely something there. Or else you wouldn't have all of these recurrences of these sacred spaces preserved in the traditions and the mythologies of cultures literally all over the globe, because it's, as I pointed out, their caves have very much the same kind of significance. Mountains have very much the same kinds of significance all across the Americas as well. So to me, that seems to be, as logical as and reasoned as you can be about this, that seems to be a logical medium by which the Watchers would still exert influence. I like the analogy that you used about the kingpins that are locked up in prison, controlling the operation, from there.
I wish I could say that was original to me, but it's not. Sadly, I've forgotten the name of the gentleman who sent that suggestion, but I think it's brilliant.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Because that says a lot about the world today. If these entities in the abyss, which we know will be released for a time in Revelation 9, are the same ones who descended to Mount Hermon back in the day, inspired for some reason this religious center at Göbekli Tepe. But you mentioned other sites in the area, and if I remember correctly, Karahan Tepe, which has just recently been discovered, is only about 20 miles east of there. How many of these other sites are there in that general region around Göbekli Tepe?
There's probably about a dozen.
Wow.
Yeah. Some of them more, just because they're better preserved, just because the archaeological record is better preserved and you have more diagnostic material to work with, you can see the legacy better. But, these places like Novali Chari and Shanlarfa that have contiguous strata with the Göbekli Tepe presence, you can definitely see, in the imagery, even some of the layout, because there are places like at Novali Chari where you have the same kind of pillar structure laid out in microcosm, not on the scale that you have at Göbekli Tepe. That's a huge site. It's 300 meters square, and there are all of these multiple, these circular temple structures throughout the course of the entire site. Now, it's interesting too that many of these kinds of sites, even in the historic era, are laid out in a circular pattern. On this side of the globe, we've got the kivas that the Anasazi, the ancient Puebloan peoples, built, which function much the same way. They believe that these places were also portals where they could, in their case, contact their gods that they revered, known as Kachinas. So, in religious symbologies, that's typically what circles come to represent. They represent completion, beginning without end, end without beginning. But they also represent, whereas squares and rectangles and things like that, four-sided shapes represent the mundane, the earthly, the planar, if you will. Circles typically represent the ephemeral or the celestial, the other, the nether. And so it makes sense that they would be laid out, not universally, but it is a recurring shape in which these kinds of temple structures are built.
Well, let's get into some of the more planar things, the stuff happening in this time-space continuum. Your Institute of Biblical Anthropology, you're offering some new courses, and I want to let people know about those. What is new? How are things developing there with the Institute?
I'm getting more students. Seems like every week. Of course, now the Figurehead program has been the 12-course module in biblical anthropology, where people get a taste of biblical ethnology and archaeology and geography and things like that. Even a little bit of smattering of language and church history too. But I've launched a couple other programs. One in biblical demonology, which is kind of self-explanatory. And then I've got another one that I launched in Preternatural Morphology, which is basically just a fancy way of saying how demons manifest in physical reality. And it's really a deep dive into looking at vampires and werewolves and revenants and zombies and things like that, chimeric creatures, these kinds of physical or seemingly physical forms that demons can take. The other program, the third new program that I'm launching is, or have launched, is a language course called The Rudiments of New Testament Greek. And so, yeah, there's a lot in terms of coursework available to people. There's a lot out there, and my midterm goal for the language stuff is to also eventually include Hebrew and Latin. And it's never been more important to know, I think, about these topics as you and I have discussed before. And I'm giving people a chance to study with me and use these anthropological models that I'm talking about and plugging them into a biblical worldview. And I think people are going to get some new insights in terms of the study of the Bible. And
that is a question I think that we ought to at least touch on, because I just had an exchange with a friend who was writing an article for a Christian publication. I don't want to name him or the publication to target the publication, but he was writing on the subject of the literal existence of these evil intelligences who want to do us harm, principalities, powers, demons, and so forth. And apparently it was a little too oogie for this publication, and they wanted him to revise and cut all of that stuff out, and he wouldn't do it because he said it's biblical. Clearly the prophets and the apostles considered these entities real, so I don't see why we shouldn't, and it's likely that they will just reject the article out of hand. Apparently, in their view, and I'm speculating because I don't know their reason specifically for what's going on here, just hearing my friend's side of the story, but it seems there are a lot of Christians out there who will look at the kinds of issues that we discuss, the book that you're working on with Aaron Judkins. We talked about the forthcoming book from Dr. Doug Hamp. We're looking forward to seeing that. The things that Mike Heiser teaches, and certainly the kind of things that Tom Horn and Steve Quayle will discuss, as all fringe, really not essential. And why are we wasting our time on this? So, if somebody were to come to you and say, "Look, what does this really have to do with Jesus?" How do you respond to that?
Two words. Caesarea Philippi. It goes back to why Jesus visited the place, why he chose it to make the statements he did about his messiahship, about the founding of the church, about the very word that he used to describe the body of Christ, the assembly. He's shoving aside this old assembly of gods and not deifying us, but we're now his assembly. To the east of again, we've talked about this before. To the east is Bashan. To the west is the land for the apostate tribe of Dan. You've got Gilgal-Rephaim to the south, the Serpent Mound, all of the Canaanite Phoenician tradition that existed there, the Mount Hermon tradition. None of this would have been lost. It's just another added layer. None of it would have been lost on any of his disciples, any of the Jews that were in earshot at Caesarea Philippi at the time, and probably the Greco-Roman inhabitants and even the native Etrurians that lived at Caesarea Philippi at the time. That's why it's important, because Jesus is firing a shot over the bay. He's giving a warning shot. And I know that you and Dr. Heiser and a number of us have used this kind of language, but that's really what Jesus is doing. It's why he chose this place to make these statements before he went back to Jerusalem to redeem humanity, to give back the title of sons of God to us.
And not coincidental that as soon as he comes down from the mountain from the Transfiguration, he casts a demon out of a young boy. And then he sends out the 70 or the 72, depending on your translation, into Galilee ahead of him, which is exactly the message there. My 70, my counsel, will replace you, B'nai Ha-Elohim.
That's right.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So, it's not to give you a trite answer with two words, Caesarea Philippi, but that I've had a number of people ask me that, and I say,
sure.
What does all this have to do with Jesus? Is it a salvific issue? No, but it's very crucial. It's theologically crucial to the narrative and to our faith. And so, you have to look at the Caesarea Philippi episode. And I think that's really the chapter in this story that ties everything together. That's why it's important. That's what it has to do with Jesus. That's what it has to do with God's long-term plan for humanity.
Yeah. I suspect if it was important to him, it ought to be important to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Jed Burton, director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, the author of Interview with the Giant, and the forthcoming... Is there a working title for the book on Göbekli Tepe, or do we have to wait for that yet?
You got to wait for that. It's that Göbekli Tepe book.
Yeah, it's forthcoming from Defender Publishing in 2021, but he will be... we will be talking with you and with Aaron when that comes available. And looking forward to an exciting year. There's a lot of interesting new stuff coming out. Doug Hamp's book is going to be really, really interesting. It's not even published yet. I'm already citing it in the book I'm working on. So, there's some really interesting stuff. God is really opening up some things here that are really fascinating, and not just because we're interested in weird stuff, but because it sheds light on how long and how important this supernatural war truly is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's an exciting time. There's some foreboding stuff out there for sure.
Yep.
But, as I tell people, our marching orders haven't changed. The Great Commission hasn't changed by one letter, by one word. We're still to go forth and make disciples. And really, this is just another component of discipleship.
Yes, absolutely. Judd's website is burtonbeyond.com. You'll also find him at tioba.org for the Institute of Biblical Anthropology.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. That's right. And I should have mentioned I have a couple of specials.
Oh, yeah, please do.
If people want to try their hand at Greek, I'm offering a special right now where you can not only get the introductory, this rudiments of Greek New Testament, but for $300 you get the Greek course. You get your choice of a 12-course certification, and you get an ebook library of texts that go along with the readings for that. Now that's a value of about $650 for $300. And if you're going to take a language class at a college or university, you're going to be paying hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars per semester hour. Not just by the course, but by semester hour. Mm-hmm. I'm wanting to get this stuff out to people because, like I said, it's never been more important to understand context. If you want to do just one of the certification programs individually, they're also available for $175. People just need to email me at professorburton@yahoo.com, and we'll get you enrolled.
All right. BurtonBeyond.com, tioba.org, the websites, and we look forward to the book. And Jed, thanks again for spending time with us tonight.
Thank you, Derek.
The Nephilim, UFOs, Planet X, and more, all in one conference, and how you can save 10% on seeing it. That's straight ahead as A View from the Bunker continues. Where were you on 10/13? As the Middle East erupts in chaos, a devastating wave of terror shocks the nation. Thousands lie dead. An apocalyptic Christian cult is blamed. And suddenly, believers disappear as internment camps spring up almost overnight. Meanwhile, a deadly virus spreads. A desperate country demands answers, and only a few dare ask, what's in the vaccine? FBI Special Agent Joe Eunice follows a trail of evidence to a small town in Iowa and a young boy who received a mysterious email from God. Now, racing against time, Agent Eunice finds himself working side by side with reclusive internet broadcaster Barney Eisen. Together, they discover a disturbing truth at the center of the conspiracy. They wrestle not against flesh and blood. The God Conspiracy, a novel by Derek P. Gilbert. Get it now in paperback and Kindle. From Rose Avenue Fiction. Driving the internet to think, this is A View from the Bunker, live from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks every Sunday night. Well, most Sunday nights. Well, occasionally on Sunday nights. I'm Derek Gilbert. We've been running into schedule conflicts. Just not enough hours in the day of recent, but you can keep up with us to make sure you never miss a new program by following us on social media. You'll find us at Twitter at ViewFromBunker or at Derek Gilbert. And remember, that's DEREK. That's important. I'll tell you why in just a moment. On Facebook, View from the Bunker. Also on Parler and MeWe. Well, forget Parler. Actually, I've dropped Parler in favor of Gab. You'll find the handle at both Gab and at MeWe, Derek P. Gilbert. And we will keep you posted as to where and when new programs are released through all of those outlets. You can also subscribe to the program at the website vftb.net, which is our global hub, of course, and that way you never miss. Just subscribe, download the programs automatically to your favorite podcatcher. Got a link in the right-hand column there at vftb.net. A couple of conferences to tell you about. One brand new and one that's kind of been pushed back later in the year. And we are looking forward to getting back to seeing people face to face again. Sharon and I, just a couple of weeks ago, were at Global Fire Ministries, Global Fire Church in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and we really, really had a great time. Pastor Jeff Jansen is hosting a new program that's going to launch this year on the It's Supernatural Network and then probably on other Christian networks around the country, called Decoding the Supernatural, which was the reason for the title of that conference. L.A. Marzulli was to be there, sadly, because of a family emergency, unexpected, unavoidable. He had to withdraw at the last minute, but Daniel Duvall showed up and was able to change his schedule at the last minute to fill in. And we hadn't seen Dan in a long time. Glad we had the opportunity to catch up. It wasn't long enough, sadly, because we were kind of passing one another. I gave 2 presentations during the conference, and after the second one, I was pretty much drained. You know, the adrenaline rush crashes on you. And then suddenly it's like, at my age, vitamin B, vitamin D, and lots and lots of coffee can only go so far. So anyway, we first met Daniel at a conference back in Chicago, back in 2011, Supernatural Science and Prophecy Conference, if I remember the name correctly, hosted by L.A. Marzulli and Russ Dizdar. And Dan came up and introduced himself there, and we were very impressed with him as a very intelligent young man, a real thinker, and he's really making a wonderful ministry for himself, Bride Ministries, especially dealing with spiritual warfare. And that will be one of the conferences that will be covered at the upcoming Discerning Minds virtual event. This is coming up quick. This is going to be next weekend. Begins Friday at 6 p.m. Central Time. That is March 26th. If you're listening to this in the archives, not a whole lot of lead time on this one, because when Hear the Watchmen, who are putting together this conference, did their last conference, virtual conference, yours truly managed to get it yanked offline because of my presentation about a certain organization that goes around the country protesting and saying the name. I'm going to be very cautious about saying that now because I don't want to get this program yanked off the air. But you know who I'm talking about, and showing step by step through their own words, the words of the co-founder and the head of the Los Angeles chapter, that they believe that they are literally summoning the dead when they say the name and then pour out that libation, the drink offering. That is exactly how the ancient Amorites summoned their dead, they believed, actually demons, 4,000 years ago in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and lured the Israelites into similar worship, which made God so angry in the days of Moses that he sent a plague that killed 24,000 Israelites. And now in the name of social justice, we are doing that very same thing on the streets of America today. But saying so, even showing video of the co-founder of the organization and the head of its largest chapter, saying in their own words that this is what we are doing, was enough to get the whole conference yanked offline. So Mike and Jeannie, knowing that they've got me on the bill again because I'm, so controversial, I guess, only giving 2 weeks notice so that the tech wizards don't have enough time to block it, apparently. So anyway, the Discerning Minds virtual conference, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, March 26th, 27th, 28th. It's 3 days. Begins at 6 p.m. Central Time on Friday and runs until 6 p.m. on Sunday. It'll be all day Saturday until 9 p.m. Saturday, and then Sunday will be live Q&A sessions with the speakers. So we will make ourselves available on Sunday to answer questions to you via live streaming video. The presentations are pre-recorded. I just got mine done this evening. It is uploading as I record this. So you will not want to miss this one because it is a wide range of topics and presenters. Besides me, you've got Pastor Paul Begley, L.A. Marzulli, who will be talking about the alien deception. Pastor Paul talking about end times prophecy. Gil Broussard talking about Planet 7X. I've had the opportunity and the pleasure of interviewing Gil about that in the past. He's not done a lot of speaking at conferences, or I should say not at conferences where our paths have crossed over the years. So looking forward to seeing what he brings to the conference this weekend. Jamie Walden, who is a dynamo. Colonel David Giammona, co-author of the new book, The Military Guide to Armageddon. And then our good friend Carl Teichrieb talking about Davos. And, when you mention Davos, you're talking about the World Economic Forum and globalism, which to the World Economic Forum right now means the Great Reset. Josh Tolley, Lucinda Bailey talking about preparedness, Sonda Allison, who's talking about, spiritual warfare, deliverance, to be precise, and John and Chelsea Jubilee talking about your health and how to eat better so you feel better and you're more effective for our King. My topic will be transhumanism and the days of Noah. I'm also bringing in the days of Lot, since Luke 17 is a parallel chapter to Matthew 24. You can't take one without the other. What were the days of Lot and the days of Noah? How does it relate to the transhumanism movement in the present day? And as per usual, I took an hour and a half. I can't say anything in less than 90 minutes lately, it seems. But that is uploading now. I pray that doesn't throw off their schedule, because I suppose I could edit it down if I had to, but I'd rather not. Anyway, you can find out more. And here's the deal about saving 10%. The cost of the conference right now is $59 for all of these presentations, which will be available for 90 days after the start of the conference. But if you use the promo code Derek, that's where the spelling is important, DEREK. Promo code Derek saves you 10% on the conference, the Discerning Minds virtual conference. To find out more and to sign up, log on to hearthewatchmen.com, hearthewatchmen.com. And that same website will get you the information about the Warriors Conference coming in September to California. Yes, Hear the Watchmen, Mike and Jeannie, brave enough to schedule a conference for California, September 16th through 18th. This is the Warriors Conference at the Legacy Resort Hotel and Spa in San Diego. And I'll say again, we're looking forward to seeing people face to face. It's only happened a few times now where we've gathered in a group over the last 12 months, and we do miss that fellowship. On the speakers list for the Warriors Conference in September, Pastor Paul Begley, Jamie Walden, Colonel David Giamona, David Heavener, Hollywood veteran and producer of, and doing some excellent investigative stuff now on his video channel, Joni Stahl, John and Chelsea Jubilee again, and you can find out more and sign up now for that conference, which, as I understand it, is limited to just 200 because of the size of the hotel, so this will be a fairly intimate gathering, and it's a great hotel. HearTheWatchmen.com. We're planning on being in Israel in October. The Skywatch TV Israel Tour, October 3rd through 18th of 2021. It is still on, and we are planning, as before, to take you to places that other tours will not go. Many other tours that go to Israel just avoid what the world calls the West Bank because they think it's not safe, but we've been there twice. Been there both times, and when you eliminate the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, more accurately, you eliminate 80% of where the places where 80% of the Bible's history took place. So Shiloh, Bethel, Joshua's altar, places like that. Hebron, the cave of the patriarchs. When you eliminate those places, you don't go those places, and there's a lot of stuff that you miss. Of course, we're also going to go back to the Golan Heights and Gilgal Rephaim. And, of course, now that we know that it's there, just a quarter of a mile away, the Serpent Mound of Bashan. The Serpent Mound of Bashan. And it's not coincidental that the name of Og's kingdom, Bashan, is based on a Semitic word that means serpent, place of the serpent. Is it possible that we've stumbled across the reason that land was called place of the serpent? I mean, this geographic feature on the landscape, which is pretty obvious from satellite. We didn't see it when we were on the ground. I mean, we literally were a stone's throw away. But we were all looking out the other side of the Jeep at Gilgal Rephaim. It's got 140 megalithic tombs on the back of this, and it's within plain line of sight with Mount Hermon. I mean, Mount Hermon is 20 miles away, but it's a 9,000-foot mountain. You can't miss it. And this serpent mound, 3/4 of a mile long, 20 to 25 feet high, is directly in between Gilgal Rephaim and Mount Hermon. So we will go there as well. And, of course, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, Masada, and then the optional 3-day tour over to Jordan to see Mount Nebo, where Moses got his only look at the Holy Land, and Petra. And the Red Desert of Wadi Rum. It's don't miss it. If you're that close, get over to the east side of the Jordan River and find out why those places are important as well. We'll be joined by our colleagues from Skywatch TV, Donna Howell and Allie Henson, and Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, who will share his the perspective of one who was raised to be an ultra-Orthodox rabbi and then accepted Jesus as his Messiah. Not to mention the research into the actual historic locations of the crucifixion and resurrection. The crucifixion, crucifixion and resurrection, the burial tomb. So those are not on the main tours either. But when you're on the Mount of Olives, it's worth making the trip. If you want to find out more, sample itinerary, costs, and reserve your place, log on to skywatchinisrael.com. That's the website, skywatchinisrael.com. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to listen this week. I appreciate it. We've got an interview with Dr. Doug Hamp coming up soon about his forthcoming book, which dovetails with what we discussed with Judd tonight and with my forthcoming book under the working title Saturn's Reign. Doug's book isn't even published yet, and I'm already citing it in my book. A number of footnotes will have his name attached to it, so you won't want to miss that. Hopefully we'll get this out next weekend. That's the plan at this point, but like I said, just subscribe at the website vftb.net to stay informed as to what's coming up here on A View from the Bunker, which is a production of Gilbert House and released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.